My girlfriend kissed her best friend in front of everyone during our wedding. Everything ended terribly wrong. Before we go on, hit subscribe and drop a comment telling us which city you're tuning in from. My name's Pedro. I'm 31, and until recently I was engaged to Ariel, 25. There were never any proven infidelities, no breakups, no extreme situations. In fact, if someone had asked me weeks before the wedding if I was sure about getting married, I probably would have said yes without much hesitation. But there's something important that was always there from the beginning, and that over time took on more weight than I wanted to admit. Her best friend, Hector. Ariel and Hector weren't ordinary friends. They hadn't met recently or in a specific context like work or university. They'd known each other since kindergarten. They literally grew up together. They had a shared history that spanned almost their entire lives. That kind of bond, in theory, should be something positive, but in practice, the dynamic between them never seemed entirely normal to me. Since I met Ariel, I noticed Hector had a very particular place in her life. It wasn't just closeness or trust. It was something harder to define, but very evident in the way they interacted. For example, Ariel talked about him constantly. It didn't matter the topic of conversation. She always found a way to mention him. She used him as an emotional reference, as a point of comparison, even as validation. Hector always supported me. Hector knows who I really am. Hector would never make me feel like this. At first, I didn't give it much thought. I thought it was normal when someone has a friend for so many years, but little by little I started noticing details that bothered me. The physical contact between them was frequent and sometimes excessive. Long hugs, too long, constant closeness. At gatherings, they tended to separate from the group, to talk among themselves, as if a separate bubble existed where the rest didn't matter. I remember a very clear scene from the first months of our relationship. We were at a gathering with several friends. Ariel was with me. Everything normal until Hector arrived. As soon as she saw him, she stood up immediately, hugged him with an intensity one hadn't seen before, and they stayed like that for several seconds. I didn't say anything at the time, but I registered it. As time went on, those kinds of situations stopped seeming isolated and started to form a pattern. When Hector was present, I took a back seat, not always obviously, but enough to notice. Conversations I was left out of, decisions where his opinion carried more weight, moments where it seemed the main connection wasn't with me. I tried to talk to Ariel about it on several occasions, always calmly. I told her there were things that made me uncomfortable, that I needed to better understand her relationship with Hector, that I felt there were unclear boundaries. Her response was predictable. She'd say I was exaggerating, that I was misinterpreting things, that Hector was like a brother to her. She repeated that idea over and over, as if that were enough to end any discussion. But to be honest, they didn't behave like siblings. Still, I decided to move forward, not because I was completely at ease, but because I wanted the relationship to work. I thought that maybe my doubts were my own insecurities, that it made no sense to sabotage something that worked in many other aspects. Time passed, and the relationship progressed to the point where I decided to propose. Ariel accepted without hesitation. It was an emotional moment with tears, hugs, and future plans. At that moment, I chose to focus on that, and not on the doubts I'd accumulated. We started organizing the wedding months later, and that's where things started to become more evident. Ariel made it clear from the beginning that Hector had to have an important role in the wedding, not just as a guest, but as someone close throughout the entire process. She wanted him to participate in decisions, to be present at meetings, to have a special place within the celebration. That made me uncomfortable. I tried to bring it up reasonably. I told her I understood their relationship, that I had no problem with him being present, but that I felt he was occupying a place that didn't belong to him in something that was supposed to be about the two of us. The conversation didn't end well. Ariel got upset. She told me I didn't understand her history with Hector, that I was being selfish, that I couldn't just treat him like any other guest. As on other occasions, I ended up giving in, not because I agreed, but because I didn't want to escalate the conflict weeks before the wedding. I convinced myself that maybe I was exaggerating, that the best thing was to let it go. During the preparations, Hector was present in many decisions. He gave opinions, suggested, intervened. But the most relevant thing wasn't that, but that Ariel validated everything he said. There were moments when I felt my opinion had less weight than his in my own wedding. Still, I went on, because canceling a wedding isn't a simple decision. There's money invested, families involved, expectations, and there's also an emotional part that pushes you to continue, even when something doesn't quite fit. The wedding day arrived, everything was organized, the venue, the decoration, the guests. The ceremony was normal. We exchanged vows, rings, smiles. Ariel looked happy. I tried to stay on that same track. The reception started without problems. Music, food, conversations, nothing out of the ordinary. Until Ariel asked for the microphone. She said she wanted to thank the important people in her life. She started with her family, some close friends, and then she paused. She looked towards one of the tables and said Hector's name. She asked him to come up. From that moment, something started to feel strange. Hector stood up and walked towards her with total naturalness. He didn't seem surprised by the situation, which was already weird. Ariel started talking about him, but it wasn't a common thank you. She talked about their childhood, about how they grew up together, about everything they'd lived through. Her voice started to break. Her eyes filled with tears. She said he'd always been there, that he was one of the most important people in her life. The atmosphere changed. It no longer seemed like a typical wedding speech. There was something more, something that didn't quite fit. I was standing next to her listening, but every word she said made me feel more displaced. Until it happened. Ariel, crying, approached Hector, hugged him, and without hesitation kissed him. It wasn't a kiss on the cheek, it was a direct kiss in front of everyone. Before her husband, had even kissed her at that point in the celebration. The room fell silent, and in that instant, everything I'd ignored for years was no longer a doubt. The silence that formed after the kiss wasn't immediate, but when it came, it was absolute. It was as if all the noise of the wedding, the music, the conversations, the laughter had been switched off at once. Nobody understood what had just happened, but everyone knew something was very wrong. I was the first to react. What was that? I said without shouting, but with an attention that even I noticed in my voice. Ariel looked at me as if she didn't understand the problem, literally as if she hadn't done anything out of the ordinary. "Honey," she said in a calm, almost condescending tone. "That's how we are. This affection has nothing sexual in it." There were immediate murmurs among the guests. They weren't discreet whispers. It was that kind of collective noise when many people talk at the same time, trying to understand something uncomfortable. I stood there looking at her, processing. "That's how we are," I repeated, in disbelief. "You're telling me that's normal?" Ariel sighed, as if I was the one exaggerating. "Pedro, please don't do this here. It's not what you think." But it no longer mattered what it wasn't. What mattered was what had happened and what had been building up for a long time. I felt how everything I'd ignored for years began to click into place at once. "Tell me something," I said, more directly now. "Have you been doing this before?" The question hung in the air. For a second, I thought she was going to deny it, but no. Ariel simply looked at me and nodded. Yes, that yes wasn't loud, it wasn't dramatic, but it was enough for the whole atmosphere to change even more. The murmurs grew. Someone let out a very clear "what" from the back. I looked at Hector. He, instead of looking uncomfortable or sorry, simply shrugged. "All the time," he said. And then the murmur stopped being a murmur. It became noise. People turning to each other, clearer comments, faces of surprise, discomfort, disbelief. Some even got up from their seats. I no longer felt just discomfort. I felt a mix of anger, humiliation, and something harder to describe. All the time, I repeated, "And you thought that wasn't important to say?" Ariel frowned. "Are you taking things out of context?" "Out of context," I replied, now raising my voice. "You just kissed him in front of everyone at our wedding." "It's not what you think," she insisted. "It has nothing to do with you." That phrase, "it has nothing to do with you." It was probably one of the most absurd things I could hear at that moment. "Of course it has to do with me," I told her. "I'm the person you're marrying, and I'm choosing you," she replied quickly. "What more do you want?" That answer didn't calm anything. On the contrary, it made it worse. "This is over," I said. It wasn't a threat. It wasn't an impulsive phrase. It was a decision. "What?" she asked, now showing real annoyance. The wedding, everything is over. The atmosphere became even more tense. Ariel let out a small laugh, but it wasn't from nerves, it was from mockery. "You're ridiculous," she said. "Really, ridiculous and insecure." That's what set everything off, because until that moment I've been trying to maintain some control, but that way of completely invalidating the situation. "No, not insecure," I replied. "After what you've just admitted." Before I could continue, a voice intervened from the side. "That's enough." Everyone turned. It was one of Ariel's sisters. She didn't seem surprised. She didn't seem uncomfortable. She seemed tired. "I'm sick of hiding it," she said in a firm tone. "These two have been sleeping together for years." The silence returned. But this time it was heavier, denser. "What?" I said almost automatically. The sister continued. "I've heard them several times. It's not something new. Some people put their hands to their mouths. Others started talking louder." The situation was no longer confusing. It was clear. I looked at Ariel, expecting maybe she'd deny it, that she'd say something, anything, but she didn't. She didn't deny anything. Instead, she sighed. "And what's wrong with that?" She said that phrase. "What do you mean, what's wrong with that?" I replied, completely incredulous. It was something. She paused, looking for words, like a practice to learn to be better in bed. There were immediate reactions throughout the room. Some laughed out of discomfort. Others simply shook their heads. "I trust Hector a lot," she continued. "That's why I did it." At that moment, Hector let out a laugh. It wasn't an exaggerated laugh. It was worse. It was a short, mocking laugh, as if the whole situation seemed absurd to him. And that was enough. I didn't think, I didn't ponder it. I just reacted. I took a step towards him and threw a punch straight at his face. The impact was clear. Hector stumbled back, bringing his hand to his nose. Blood started to come out almost immediately. The screams didn't take long to appear. Someone screamed, "Hey," from the side. Another said, "Separate them." Hector tried to react, but before he could do anything else, several people intervened. Two of my friends held me by the arms. Two others did the same to him. "Let me go," Hector shouted, trying to break free with an agitated voice and a bleeding nose. "Calm down," those holding him yelled. I was also trying to get free, not necessarily to keep hitting him, but because all the pin-up tension needed to get out somehow. The room, which minutes before was a wedding, was now total chaos. People standing, arguments, screams, some recording with their phones, others trying to calm the situation. Ariel was on the side watching everything, without intervening, without saying anything. And at that moment, while several people were holding me to prevent everything from escalating further, I understood that what had happened wasn't a mistake or a bad moment. It was the reality I'd been ignoring all this time. Everything had gotten completely out of control. People were still holding me, although I wasn't trying to lunge at Hector again. The adrenaline started to wear off little by little, but what replaced it was something heavier, a feeling of emptiness mixed with an uncomfortable clarity. I looked at Ariel. She was still standing there, as if nothing that was happening was really serious. That's what finally broke whatever was left. "Get out," I told her. I didn't shout. I didn't need to, but it was clear enough for her to hear. She frowned. "What?" I said, "Get out," I repeated. "The wedding's over. This is where it all ends." Some guests stopped talking for a moment when they heard that. Others were already too caught up in the chaos to react. Ariel let out a breath through her nose, annoyed. "You're making an unnecessary scene." I didn't answer immediately. I just looked at her, trying to understand how she could continue to minimize everything. But before the discussion could continue, another voice broke in. A scream. "What's happening?" Everyone turned. It was a woman who was sitting a few tables back. Until that moment, she had remained silent, completely pale, as if she were just processing what she'd heard. It was Hector's girlfriend. Few people knew she was there, and even fewer knew her situation. She was pregnant. She stood up abruptly, visibly upset. "You told me that kissing thing was normal," she shouted at Hector. "You said it was a way of showing affection that meant nothing." Hector didn't answer. He couldn't. "But you never told me you were sleeping with her," the woman continued, now with her voice breaking. "Never." The room filled with murmurs again, but this time with a different tone. It wasn't just surprise, it was real tension. The woman put a hand on her abdomen, breathing with difficulty. I accepted a lot of things, she said, because I loved you. But this, she didn't finish the sentence. She swayed. Someone tried to approach, but didn't make it in time. She fainted. The impact of the body against the floor resonated more than it should have in that charged silence. Everything changed again. Now it wasn't just an emotional scandal, it was an emergency. Several people ran towards her. Someone called for an ambulance. Others tried to react without knowing what to do. Hector, still with a bleeding nose, stopped resisting. "Let me go," he said desperately. "She's my girlfriend," but no one let him go immediately. I stood there watching the scene without moving, without saying anything, as if everything was already too far away from me. The woman was taken away urgently. The wedding ended at that moment. There was no closure, no formal goodbyes, just people leaving in silence in small groups, commenting on what they'd just witnessed. What had started as a celebration ended as something completely different. The following days were confusing. I didn't talk to Ariel. I didn't want to. I didn't try to understand more either. I felt I'd already understood enough. But the story didn't end there, because what happened at the wedding began to have consequences outside of that moment. Hector's girlfriend was hospitalized, and days later the worst was known. She lost the baby. The news spread quickly, and with it came something else. The woman's father. He hadn't been at the wedding. He didn't know anything about what happened in real time. But when he found out, the reaction wasn't calm. It wasn't rational, it was direct. He looked for Hector, and when he found him, he beat him. It wasn't a brief fight or something someone could easily break up. It was an intense assault, filled with accumulated rage. Hector ended up in the hospital with serious injuries. He's currently in intensive care. That's what I was told. I haven't gone to see him. I have no intention of doing so. But he wasn't the only one. The woman's father also found Ariel. And although it wasn't on the same level, there was a reaction. He slapped her just once, but enough for everything to escalate even more. The man was arrested. He's in jail now. And the strangest thing of all is that, as I found out later, Ariel had known that family for years. They were close. There was a prior relationship that made everything even more complicated. It wasn't random. It wasn't a coincidence. It was a circle that was somehow already connected from before. Everything ended badly. There's no simpler way to say it. There was no reconciliation, no emotional closure, just a chain of events that got out of control and ended up affecting many more people than were initially involved. Sometimes I think about what would have happened if I'd made different decisions before, if I'd set clearer boundaries, if I'd paid attention to the signs. But the reality is different. I ignored many things, and in the end, everything exploded at the worst possible moment. The day that was supposed to be the beginning of something ended up being the definitive end. Update. It's been about a month since everything that happened at the wedding. I didn't intend to write again, but many people have been asking me what happened next, especially with Hector. The truth is the situation didn't get better. In fact, it got worse. During the first few weeks, everything was confusing. I completely distanced myself from Ariel and anyone related to her. I changed routines, stopped answering messages, even avoided going out more than necessary. I didn't want to know anything, but the information started to arrive anyway. First through mutual friends, then through people who were at the wedding, and then directly through relatives who also found out what happened. The most frequent question was the same: what had happened with Hector? And now there's a definitive answer. Hector passed away. He didn't survive the injuries from the beating. He was in intensive care for several days, but his condition was too serious. He finally died. When I found out, I didn't know exactly how to react. I didn't feel relief, nor sadness as such. It was more of a strange feeling, hard to describe, as if everything had reached a point of no return. Something that started as a betrayal ended in something much bigger. After that, the legal situation became even more complicated. The father of Hector's girlfriend, who had been arrested, managed to escape. I don't have exact details of how it happened, but what I do know is that he's no longer in custody. And that completely changed the outlook for several people involved, especially for Ariel. According to what I've been told, after Hector's death was confirmed, reports began to surface that the woman's father was looking for her. At first they were just rumors, then they stopped being rumors. Apparently, he was seen following her on at least one occasion. There were also calls. I don't know exactly what was said in those calls, but I do know they were enough for Ariel to make an immediate decision. She left the city. She didn't give many details. She simply disappeared from her usual surroundings. She closed her social media, stopped responding to most people, and left. All for safety. Ironically, that's the first time I've heard of her taking a situation seriously. I haven't had any contact with her since the day of the wedding, and after all this I have no intention of doing so. As for me, I've been trying to get back to normal little by little. It hasn't been easy, not just because of what happened that day, but because of everything that came after. I never imagined that something like this would end with such serious consequences. If someone had told me before the wedding how all this was going to end, I wouldn't have believed it, but it happened. And now all that's left is to move forward with everything that implies.